August 18th, 2025. Burkina Faso did the unthinkable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré ordered the entire U.S. embassy to pack up and leave. And let's be honest, who else on earth dares to tell Washington, get out? A so-called weak and poor country standing eye to eye with the most powerful nation alive. The twist? In America, it looks like madness. But across Africa, millions shouted one word instead: freedom. Standing at the center, in his red beret, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To some, reckless. To others, a lion. Either way, the world is now forced to listen. Before we dive deeper, tell me, where are you watching from? Would you choose aid with humiliation or dignity with risk? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear how you see this. And if you're new here, welcome to this channel. We bring you Africa's untold stories, raw, unfiltered, and often the ones mainstream media would rather ignore. Especially for those of you watching from the US and across the Americas. This is where you get to see Africa speak with its own voice. So stay close, because what happened in Ouagadougou wasn't just a diplomatic move. It was the opening shot of a story that might reshape the balance of power. And that story begins right now. The first shock was not the decree itself, but the silence that fell before it. In Ouagadougou, soldiers stood outside the U.S. embassy, boots pressed into the red dust, rifles slung but unmoving. Behind the gates, staff hurried to pack boxes under the weight of a decision no one thought would actually come. And then, the order broke. The United States was no longer welcome. Not just an ambassador, not a handful of diplomats. The entire mission, gone in 72 hours. For Washington, it was a diplomatic memo, something to debate in polished rooms. But for the people in Burkina Faso, it was a rupture they could see with their own eyes. A flag lowered in the harsh Sahel sun does not look like paperwork, it looks like a funeral. And maybe that's the irony. What in one capital was treated as protocol felt, on the ground, like history being buried. Some might ask, how does a country so often described as poor dare to push out the richest nation alive? The answer lies in the insult that sparked it all. A U.S. report that ranked Burkinabè soldiers beside the very terrorists they've been dying to fight. Imagine giving your life to defend a school or a market, only to be told on paper you're no different from the killers. Most Americans, if they could picture their sons in uniform being called criminals after battle, would feel the same rage. One young soldier in Kaya said it plainly: "We bled at Jibo, we buried brothers in Yaga, and they compare us with Al-Qaeda?" His words were not lofty, they were human. And in that moment, the abstract language of human rights reports collapsed under the weight of lived experience. According to surveys in the US, most people rank respect above money when asked what makes life worth living. It's a universal truth. Humans can survive scarcity, but they break under humiliation. That is the hinge of this story. Aid might fill bellies, but dignity fills souls. So when the decree was read on state television, the silence that had hung in the capital gave way to chants in the street. Sovereignty is not for sale. Mothers lifted their children so they could see the flag fall. A veteran on a crutch whispered to a journalist, "For decades they told us we were too weak to stand alone. Today, our captain proved them wrong." And just like that, a routine morning in the Sahel turned into a turning point. The embassy gates were still standing, but something invisible had already shifted. What happens next flows from that silence, that rupture, and the chants that replaced it. What made this rupture even sharper was the contradiction buried in the paperwork itself. The same Washington that praised Burkina Faso for fighting jihadists on one page placed its soldiers in the same category as those jihadists on the next. For officials in D.C., it was language. For men in uniform, it was betrayal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read the report aloud to his ministers, his finger dragging across every paragraph marked in red. "They dare to write this," he said, his voice flat but cutting. In that moment, the news became personal. And here's the twist. When leadership feels insult, the people often feel it twice as hard. That is how a line in a report turned into a spark on the streets. Think about it in American terms. If the Pentagon released a memo equating U.S. Marines with terrorists, even for one sentence, the backlash would be deafening. According to Gallup surveys, respect for the military is one of the most deeply held values in the US. Now imagine stripping that respect away. Most Americans would not shrug. They would rage. And that's exactly what young Burkinabè soldiers did when they heard the words broadcast on national television. One short story tells the whole picture. In a barracks outside Kaya, soldiers sat crowded around a flickering TV. The broadcaster read the U.S. accusations line by line. Silence filled the room until a private muttered, "So our captain was right, they call us criminals." Another soldier snapped back bitterly, "We fought in Yaga, we bled at Jibo, and still, they put us in the same breath as Al-Qaeda." It wasn't staged, it wasn't propaganda, it was raw disbelief. Here's where the paradox deepens. On the one hand, the U.S. was sending security funds and military training. On the other, it was condemning the very forces it was supposedly supporting. Aid with one hand, humiliation with the other. And anyone who has lived through that tension knows which part leaves the deeper scar. The human truth is simple. People can live with fewer resources, but they can't live with being written out of dignity. Most Americans would probably agree. Losing money is painful, but losing honor can feel unbearable. And maybe that's why when Traoré shouted, "Aid without dignity is a chain," the line hit harder than any policy speech. By the time the sun set that evening, the words were echoing in the streets, mixing with chants and rising anger. What started as ink on paper was now painted across faces, fists, and voices. And from that anger came a choice that would carry Burkina Faso into the next collision. The threat came fast and heavy. Washington warned that more than $100 million in annual assistance could vanish overnight. Clinics, schools, food shipments, all placed on the chopping block. For America, it was leverage. For Burkina Faso, it was a test of pride. And here's the contradiction. The very aid meant to save lives was framed as a punishment if a nation dared to stand tall. Aid as medicine on one day, and aid as a weapon the next. That paradox cut deeper than the money itself. Traoré answered bluntly, "Aid without dignity is a chain. Better hunger and freedom than bread and humiliation." Words like that can sound reckless in a policy room, but outside those walls, they lit a fire. Picture the conversation in a minister's office. An advisor leaned in nervously. "Captain, America funds our schools, our hospitals." Traoré cut him off with a palm on the table. "A classroom built on humiliation teaches slavery." The silence that followed wasn't just in that room. It spread across radios, headlines, and kitchens where families debated if bread without honor was still worth eating. Most Americans can relate more than they think. According to Pew surveys, when asked what defines a good life, respect ranks higher than wealth for the majority. And if you've ever seen a worker quit a job over being disrespected, even while needing the paycheck, you know the psychology. Humans tolerate scarcity longer than they tolerate humiliation. One farmer in the Sahel captured it without statistics. His hands cracked from tilling dry soil. He told a reporter, "Maybe we starve, but better to be hungry in dignity than fed in chains." His voice wasn't angry, it was resigned but firm. The kind of sentence that turns into a slogan before anyone plans it. That evening, chants swelled in Ouagadougou. Students carried signs, mothers lifted their children above the crowd, veterans raised crutches like banners. The anger had transformed into something more stubborn, defiance. And from that defiance, another wave was about to build, one that wouldn't stop at the borders of Burkina Faso. The strangest part was how differently the world reacted. Paris called it reckless. Brussels warned of isolation, yet Moscow hailed Traoré as a lion, and Ankara promised brotherhood. Meanwhile, Beijing stayed quiet, watching the storm while quietly moving its pieces. It was the same event, but four separate stories depending on who told it. That contradiction revealed something deeper. If one nation's expulsion can be labeled as both suicide and emancipation, then maybe the real fight isn't over embassies at all. It's over who controls the narrative. And that's a battlefield often more dangerous than guns. Consider this. When France framed the move as cutting the last rope, they imagined a nation adrift. But when Russian commentators said, "This is not madness, this is emancipation," They saw the same rope as a chain being broken. Same rope, opposite meaning. And most people, whether in Africa or America, know the feeling of a story told about them without their consent. According to social psychology research, humans respond more strongly to loss of voice than loss of material goods. You can take away a paycheck, but take away someone's right to define themselves, and the wound runs deeper. One short scene captured this perfectly. In a crowded cafe in Ouagadougou, students leaned over a single phone, scrolling headlines in French and English. One headline read, "Burkina Faso risks collapse." Another, translated from Russian, read, "Burkina Faso leads Africa's rebirth." A young man laughed bitterly. "So which is it? Are we dying or are we leading?" His friend answered quietly, "Depends on who holds the pen." That exchange, more than any official statement, showed why this story refused to stay local. And here's the quiet twist beneath the noise. The louder Western capitals shouted about isolation, the more ordinary Burkinabè felt less isolated. The chants in the streets were no longer defensive. They were celebratory. What began as anger was starting to sound like pride. It's a familiar human pattern. Most Americans, when criticized harshly by outsiders, close ranks at home. The same way a family argues inside the house but unites when insulted from the outside. Burkina Faso was no different. And that unity, fragile at first, was hardening into something far more resilient. By nightfall, the voices of Paris, Brussels, Moscow, and Ankara blurred into background noise. The only sound that mattered was the roar of a crowd in Ouagadougou chanting into the Sahel air. From that roar, the story was about to turn again, into something even bigger than foreign headlines. What startled observers most was not the embassy closing but the streets opening. Instead of panic, Ouagadougou erupted in chants, banners, and flags. The AES alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, suddenly became more than a treaty on paper. It was a symbol painted across faces, waved in fists, carried by youth who had grown up being told their countries were too fragile to stand. Here's the irony. Just 2 years earlier, analysts in the West called these states failed experiments. Yet now, those same fragile nations were linking arms, creating an image of strength that headlines struggled to explain. How can 3 countries once described as weak look stronger the moment they are pushed out of the Western orbit? It's the paradox of pressure. Sometimes, the tighter the grip, the more unity forms. A short story brings it home. In the main square, an old veteran leaned on his cane, his leg lost to a roadside bomb years ago. When the embassy gates closed, he raised his voice above the crowd. "We bury not America, but arrogance itself." For the people around him, it wasn't just rhetoric, it was lived history condensed into one sentence. And maybe you felt something similar. Most Americans, when hearing a grandparent speak about past wars, sense a truth no textbook can deliver. Words carry weight when they are tied to sacrifice. The mini twist is this. While Washington framed the expulsion as isolation, the people on the ground experienced it as inclusion. For the first time, their struggle seemed part of something bigger than borders. Human behavior studies show that belonging often outweighs material security. You can have food and shelter, but without a sense of belonging, you still feel poor. Conversely, even in hardship, a community united around shared purpose feels rich in ways outsiders can't measure. That's why the chants grew louder than the warnings. Mothers who once whispered about survival were now shouting about sovereignty. Students who used to debate quietly in classrooms marched together in the streets. Before, there was resignation. After, there was defiance. And defiance has a strange way of sounding like hope. By the time dusk settled, the AES flag was flying higher than the American one had that morning. The crowd didn't just see cloth rising on a pole. They saw themselves rising with it. And from that vision, the next chapter was already taking shape, sharper, riskier, and impossible to ignore. The loudest reaction wasn't the one shouted in Western capitals. It was the silence that came from Beijing. While Washington threatened aid cuts and Paris muttered about recklessness, China chose not to condemn, not to applaud, but to send quiet envoys with offers of food shipments and technical aid. And in a world addicted to noise, silence can sometimes speak the loudest. This is where the contradictions sharpen. Moscow praised Traoré as a young lion. Ankara offered hospitals and brotherhood. But Beijing slipped in with no cameras, no lectures. It raised a question many Africans whispered. Which is more valuable, loud promises or quiet respect? Most people know the feeling. When someone stops talking at you and simply listens, it changes the balance of power. One evening in the presidential palace, Traoré tapped the table while his ministers debated. The West threatens, Russia applauds, China observes. Each plays its game, but we must hold the board. His words cut through the room. It wasn't a rejection of help, it was a rejection of dependency. And there's a subtle twist here. In trying to punish Burkina Faso, the West ended up making its rivals look like better partners. According to studies on human behavior, people value autonomy even over comfort. Most Americans, if asked whether they'd prefer a smaller paycheck with freedom or a larger one under constant control, lean toward freedom. It's the same logic being played out in the Sahel, but on a geopolitical scale. A story from the market in Ouagadougou made it real. A woman selling onions told a reporter, "The French gave us bread with conditions. The Americans gave us medicine with lectures. But when the Turks built a clinic, they just gave the keys." Her comment wasn't framed as politics, but as lived experience. And maybe that's why crowds cheered Ankara's gestures louder than Brussels' warnings. The paradox is clear. The more the West screamed isolation, the more alternatives walked through the door. What was supposed to look like Burkina Faso being cut off began to feel like Burkina Faso choosing from new shelves. Defiance had shifted into bargaining power. By nightfall, as radios carried news of Russian praise and Turkish promises, the mood in Ouagadougou was no longer one of fear. It was something else entirely. The sense that for the first time, they were not begging at the table, they were sitting at it. And from that seat, another step was about to be taken, one even bolder than the last. The embassy gates clanged shut, but the sound that echoed louder was not steel. It was the chants that refused to die down. By dawn, convoys of black SUVs had rolled out of Ouagadougou, and for the first time in decades, the American flag no longer flew over the capital. That absence became its own presence, a silence that demanded interpretation. Here's the contradiction. In Washington, analysts called it diplomatic suicide. In Ouagadougou, people called it a rebirth. The same act carried opposite meanings, depending on who was watching. And maybe that's the real shock. That one nation's exit can look like collapse on CNN, but like liberation on the streets where it happened. One mural captured the mood better than any speech. On a wall downtown, artists painted the American flag descending a pole, while the AES flag climbed above it. Beneath the images, the words, "Our story, our pen." When Traoré visited quietly, he asked the artist, "Is this the real struggle? Guns against guns? Or voices against silence?" The painter replied without looking up. "They told us our history began with slavery. Now we tell them it begins with sovereignty." It was a short exchange, but it cut deeper than hours of debate. And there's another twist here. The West had intended to isolate Burkina Faso, but in practice it isolated itself. Crowds in Mali and Niger raised the same AES flag. Youth in Bamako and Niamey chanted, "No more borrowed voices." What looked like one country's gamble was turning into a regional chorus. Humans respond to momentum. Once one dares to break the silence, others follow. According to behavioral studies, people rarely move first, but once a single figure defies the rules, conformity flips into rebellion. That pattern was unfolding across the Sahel. In everyday terms, it felt like a family argument breaking into open defiance of the parent. Before, obedience was the default. Now, resistance was the habit. And like any habit, once it forms, it rarely goes back. Most Americans know the feeling too. Once you've walked out of a job where you were disrespected, going back to bowing feels impossible. By nightfall, the symbolism was complete. The U.S. flag was gone. The AES banner remained. And the people who once whispered about survival were now shouting about authorship. The story had shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer playing defense, it was writing offense. The roar of those chants, carried on Sahel winds, left one lingering question hanging in the air. Was this the first step into dangerous isolation? Or the first time in generations Africa finally spoke with its own voice? The answer would not be written in foreign reports. It would be written in what came next. The most unsettling image wasn't the embassy gates shutting, it was the empty flagpole that remained after. For decades, that pole carried the stars and stripes, a reminder of who held the pen to Africa's story. Now it stood bare, and that absence raised a question the world could no longer dodge. In Washington, headlines warned of collapse, of famine, of a country walking into the abyss. Yet in Ouagadougou, people described the moment as the first breath after years underwater. Two realities, two interpretations, one act. And maybe that's the real fracture, not just between nations, but between narratives. Traoré closed his speech with words that still linger. We are not expelling a building. We are expelling an attitude. For some, that sounded reckless. For others, it sounded like the line that divided dependency from dignity. And history tends to remember lines more than policies. Think of the moments Americans recall most, the declarations all men are created equal, or Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you. One sentence, in the right context, can outlive the men who spoke it. A short story from the crowd captured it better than any politician. A mother lifted her daughter onto her shoulders as the embassy convoy rolled away. Reporters asked why she came. Her answer was simple: so she will remember the day we stopped bowing. That moment, ordinary and unpolished, explained why chants grew louder than threats. Humans everywhere respond to this same truth. According to research, people can accept hardship if they believe it carries meaning, but they rarely accept humiliation without revolt. And isn't that the dilemma here? Would you trade dignity for comfort if the comfort came at the price of silence? Or would you risk more just to walk upright? As the night deepened, Ouagadougou felt both smaller and larger at once. Smaller without the embassy, larger in the imagination of those who saw defiance as a seed. Seeds are fragile, yes, but they grow in places no one expects. And this one had just been planted in Sahel soil. So was it madness, or was it courage? That choice isn't for Washington to decide, or Moscow, or Paris. It's for the people who carried their voices into the streets, and for you watching now to reflect on. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't let it fade. Subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts below. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what does freedom mean to you in your own life? Because one thing is certain, this story doesn't end here. It's only the beginning of something bigger, and the next chapter is already writing itself.